October 1969, Dearborn, Michigan. The air inside Ford's engineering center smelled like machine oil and ambition. Under harsh fluorescent lights, a brand new V8 engine sat bolted to a steel stand. Cast iron block, wide cylinder heads, intake ports so massive they looked almost aggressive. Everything about this motor screamed performance. Everything about it looked like a race engine that had somehow escaped the track and wandered into a production car program. The engineers standing around it didn't just believe they had built something good, they believed they had created the next legend. A motor that could replace the aging small blocks that had carried Ford through the 1960s. A motor that could dominate NASCAR and Trans Am racing. A motor powerful enough to carry the Mustang into the 1970s and beyond. It was called the 351 Cleveland, named after the Ford plant in Cleveland, Ohio, where it would be manufactured. On paper, it looked absolutely unstoppable. Massive breathing capability that rivaled engines twice its size. Huge valves borrowed from big block philosophy. Race-inspired cylinder heads designed from the ground up for airflow. The kind of engineering that promised horsepower numbers Detroit had never seen from a small block Ford. But what almost nobody knows is this. For a brief moment in the early 1970s, this engine didn't just threaten Ford's racing ambitions. It nearly destroyed the reputation of the Mustang itself. Because the same engineering decisions that made the Cleveland brilliant on paper also made it dangerously misunderstood on the street. And when problems started appearing, the consequences were brutal. To understand how this happened, you have to go back a few years and understand what Ford was facing. By the late 1960s, the Mustang was already a legend. Since its debut in April 1964, Ford had sold over 1 million units in less than 2 years. No car in American history had ever achieved that kind of success so quickly. The pony car revolution had begun, and rivals like the Chevrolet Camaro, Pontiac Firebird, and Plymouth Barracuda were rushing desperately to catch up. Ford had struck gold. But there was a problem brewing under all those hoods. Ford's engine lineup was getting crowded, complicated, and increasingly outdated. The Windsor small block family, engines like the beloved 289 and the early 302, used a traditional design philosophy. Modest port sizes, smaller valves, conventional head architecture that had served Ford well for years. These engines were reliable. They were compact. They were cheap to produce and easy to service, but they were starting to run out of breathing room, literally. As horsepower wars intensified throughout the late 1960s, Ford engineers realized a painful truth. Those Windsor heads simply couldn't move enough air at high RPM. The ports were too small. The valves were too restrictive. Once you pushed these engines past about 6,000 RPM, airflow became the bottleneck that choked power production. Chevrolet's small blocks were pulling ahead. Chrysler's Hemis were making headlines. Ford needed an answer, so they decided to try something radical. Instead of designing an entirely new big block to compete with the giants, they built a small block that breathed like one. The project took shape at Ford's Cleveland engine plant in Ohio. That's where the engine got its name. And from the very beginning, the design philosophy was different from anything Ford had attempted before with a small block. When the first prototypes came together in late 1969, they looked nothing like the Windsor engines they were meant to eventually replace. The 351 Cleveland used a bore of 4.0 inches and a stroke of 350 inches, giving it 351 cubic inches of displacement. Those numbers weren't revolutionary. What made this engine special lived in the cylinder heads. Ford engineers designed what they called canted-valve heads. Instead of placing intake and exhaust valves in a straight line like most conventional small blocks, the Cleveland tilted them at carefully calculated angles, much like the massive big block 429 and 460 engines that powered Ford's largest performance cars. That unconventional valve arrangement allowed for something critical: massive valves. The high-performance 4V heads used intake valves measuring 2.19 inches in diameter and exhaust valves measuring 1.71 inches. For comparison, a typical 302 Windsor small block used valves nearly a quarter-inch smaller on both sides. That might not sound like much, but in the world of engine airflow, those fractions of an inch translate directly into cubic feet per minute of air movement, and that means power. The intake ports themselves were enormous. So large, in fact, that mechanics and engine builders later joked you could literally drop a golf ball through them and watch it disappear into the combustion chamber. All that space meant airflow numbers that were absolutely unheard of for a small block engine of this era. Peak airflow through the 4V Cleveland heads exceeded 260 CFM. For context, most competing small blocks struggled to reach 200 CFM, and airflow equals power. At least in theory. Because there was a problem hiding inside this brilliant design, and Ford wouldn't discover how serious it was until these engines hit the street in customer hands. In 1970, the 351 Cleveland officially launched in the Mustang lineup. Two main versions were offered to buyers. The 351C2V was designed for everyday street cars. It used smaller, more conservative ports and a two-barrel carburetor setup. This version produced approximately 250 horsepower and 355 pound-feet of torque. Respectable numbers, solid daily driver performance, nothing that would set the world on fire. Then there was the monster, the 351C4V. This was the engine Ford's engineers had really been dreaming about. This version ran a screaming 11.01 compression ratio. It used those giant ports and oversized valves. It breathed through a four-barrel carburetor that could feed the engine's insatiable appetite for air. Factory ratings claimed 300 horsepower and 380 lb-ft of torque. But those numbers were deliberately conservative. Automakers in this era routinely underrated horsepower for insurance purposes. The truth was far more impressive. In reality, independent dyno tests consistently showed the 351C4V producing closer to 320 horsepower in completely stock trim. Some examples tested even higher. And in race preparation, things got absolutely wild. With open headers, aggressive camshafts, ported heads, and high-octane fuel, Cleveland engines could push well over 400 horsepower without breaking a sweat, all from a small block that weighed hundreds of pounds less than the big block alternatives. On paper, the Mustang had never looked stronger. Ford had seemingly created the perfect weapon. But there was a hidden flaw lurking deep inside the Cleveland's design, and drivers were about to discover it the hard way. The issue started with those impressive airflow numbers. Those giant ports that looked so impressive in engineering drawings and flowed so beautifully on test benches were almost too big for street application. At high RPM, they worked exactly as designed. Air rushed through the heads like a hurricane. The engine could pull hard past 6,500 RPM, screaming toward redline with an urgency that most American street engines couldn't dream of matching. Up top, the Cleveland was a monster. But at lower RPM, air velocity dropped dramatically. Instead of rushing into the cylinders with force and momentum, the air slowed down inside those cavernous ports. The mixture became lazy. Cylinder fillings suffered. Throttle response became sluggish and inconsistent. Torque delivery felt unpredictable at part throttle. For everyday driving, stoplight to stoplight, highway cruising, normal commuting, the engine could feel strangely lazy and unresponsive. Mustang owners expecting brutal, tire-shredding muscle car punch from idle sometimes got something very different. A motor that only truly woke up when you pushed it hard into the upper RPM ranges. That wasn't what most buyers expected from a performance V8. And then another problem started appearing across the country. Fuel consumption. With compression ratios as high as 11.0.1, the Cleveland absolutely demanded premium fuel. There was no negotiating with this engine. Feed it regular gasoline and detonation would quickly destroy internal components. And even with proper fuel, the Cleveland drank heavily. In real-world driving conditions, some owners reported fuel economy dipping well below 10 miles per gallon. 8 miles per gallon wasn't unusual for spirited driving. At the height of the muscle car era, that wasn't ideal, but it wasn't catastrophic either. Muscle car buyers expected to pay for performance at the pump. The real nightmare came from somewhere else entirely: oil. Deep inside the Cleveland block, Ford engineers made a fundamental design decision that would haunt the engine's reputation for years. The oiling system was configured to feed the camshaft bearings first and the crankshaft bearings second. That might sound harmless. After all, both components need lubrication. But at high RPM, that priority sequence became potentially deadly. The cam bearings, under the stress of high RPM operation, could consume massive amounts of oil flow before passing lubrication downstream, which meant significantly less oil reaching the crankshaft and connecting rod bearings, the components that absolutely, under no circumstances, can be allowed to run dry. At sustained high RPM operation, at 6,500 RPM and above, that oil starvation could become catastrophically destructive. Mechanics across the country began reporting frightening damage patterns. Rod bearings came out burned black and scored beyond recognition. Metal flakes and particles filled oil pans after only moderate use. Crankshafts seized violently, sometimes destroying entire bottom ends in seconds. One veteran Ford technician who worked through this era later described opening a failed Cleveland engine in his shop and saying, "The bearings looked like charcoal briquettes, like someone had run the engine dry for miles. But the owner swore he checked his oil religiously. The engine just ate itself." The problem became most obvious and most public during racing, and that's where the Cleveland's reputation nearly collapsed entirely. In NASCAR competition during the early 1970s, Ford factory teams and privateers quickly adopted Cleveland-based engines as their weapon of choice. On the dyno, under controlled conditions, these engines were absolute monsters. Some race-prepared versions pushed 450 horsepower from 351 cubic inches. They revved higher and faster than most big blocks could safely sustain. They promised incredible top-end speed on superspeedways, but during actual races, engines started dying with alarming regularity. Oil pressure would suddenly plummet mid-race. Bearing temperatures would spike dangerously. Rod bearings would overheat and weld themselves to crankshaft journals. Entire engines would seize catastrophically, sometimes violently enough to lock rear wheels at speed. At several high-profile events in 1970 and 1971, Cleveland-powered cars retired early with catastrophic engine failures that couldn't be explained by driver error or mechanical abuse. Drivers loved the power. They loved the top-end pull. They loved how the engine screamed toward redline. But crews hated the repairs. They hated the unpredictability. They hated explaining to sponsors why expensive race engines were dying. And the Mustang name, so closely tied to Ford's performance image, began to suffer in the public eye. Customers heard the stories through magazines and word of mouth. Engines blowing up without warning. Oil starvation failures, high maintenance requirements, unpredictable reliability. Suddenly, the 351 Cleveland wasn't the unstoppable performance hero Ford had promised. It was starting to look like a ticking time bomb, and Ford needed a fix. Fast. The solution eventually came not from Ford's engineering department. It came from the racers themselves. Experienced engine builders who had been fighting Cleveland failures for months finally diagnosed the root cause. They realized the problem wasn't the engine's fundamental strength. The Cleveland block itself was incredibly robust. Thick cylinder walls allowed overbores of 0.030 inches or more without any risk of cracking. The rotating assembly could handle tremendous stress. The weakness was simply oil routing priority, so they changed it. Instead of feeding the camshaft first, race teams began modifying Cleveland blocks to send high-pressure oil directly to the main bearings from the oil pump. Crankshaft first, connecting rods second, everything else after that. The modification was mechanically simple, but brilliant in execution. External oil lines were drilled and routed along the block, bypassing the factory oiling circuit and delivering maximum pressure lubrication straight to the crank and rod bearings. Suddenly, the failures stopped. Engines that previously died after a few races now survived entire competitive seasons. Bearings that burned black now came out looking nearly new at teardown. And when the Cleveland's oiling worked properly, the engine was absolutely terrifyingly fast. One of the most famous examples came during 1971 Trans Am racing competition. Mustangs powered by properly prepared Cleveland engines became fierce competitors that other teams feared. The combination of high RPM power delivery, lightweight small block packaging, and now reliable operation allowed Ford teams to push harder and longer than ever before. Drivers reported engines pulling cleanly and confidently past 7,000 RPM, sustaining power levels that few American V8s could safely match. And on long straightaways, Cleveland-powered Mustangs simply walked away from rivals who couldn't match their top-end speed. The engine that nearly destroyed Ford's racing reputation was suddenly winning races and earning respect. But just as the Cleveland was finally proving itself worthy of Ford's original ambitions, the entire world changed. In 1973, the oil crisis hit America. Fuel prices skyrocketed practically overnight. Gas lines stretched around blocks. Conservation became the national priority. High-compression, fuel-hungry performance engines suddenly looked irresponsible and even unpatriotic. At the same time, new federal emissions regulations forced automakers to dramatically lower compression ratios and reduce horsepower outputs to meet clean air standards. The Cleveland's 11-1 compression design became absolutely impossible to maintain in this new reality. By 1972, compression had already been reduced to around 9.51, dropping horsepower significantly from the original specifications. The once mighty 351C4V went from its original 300 horsepower rating to figures closer to 266 horsepower under the new SAE net measurement standards that became mandatory. Performance dropped substantially. Buyer interest faded quickly. And by 1974, Ford quietly discontinued the Cleveland engine family in American production entirely. The engine that once promised to dominate the muscle car era for years to come was gone after only 4 years of production, but its story didn't end in America. In Australia, the Cleveland lived on. Ford's Australian division continued producing and developing the engine for years after American production ceased. They installed it in Falcons, panel vans, and various high-performance models that Australian buyers demanded. There, far from American emissions regulations, the Cleveland earned a second life and a devoted following. With improved oiling systems developed from racing experience and better tuning for local conditions, the Cleveland became an absolute legend among Australian muscle car fans who recognized its potential. Back in the United States, enthusiasts eventually rediscovered the engine decades later. Hot rodders and engine builders realized something important during the 1980s and 1990s as they searched for overlooked performance platforms. Once you properly fixed the oiling issue, the 351 Cleveland was one of the best breathing small block engines ever manufactured by any American company. Those giant ports that hurt low-speed response on the street, they became an absolute dream for racing applications and high RPM performance builds. Modern Cleveland builds regularly produce 500 horsepower, naturally aspirated with nothing more exotic than good heads, proper camshaft selection, and careful tuning. With forced induction, superchargers, or turbochargers, these engines easily exceed 700 horsepower on pump gas. The engine that once threatened to destroy the Mustang's reputation eventually became a cult icon among serious performance enthusiasts. Today, original Boss 351 Mustangs powered by Cleveland engines sell for well over $150,000 at collector auctions. Pristine examples have crossed $200,000. What was once misunderstood and unfairly maligned is now celebrated as one of Ford's greatest engineering achievements. So yes, for a brief, dangerous moment in the early 1970s, Ford's ambitious 351 Cleveland nearly damaged the Mustang legacy that the company had spent years building. Its radical, forward-thinking design created problems few engineers anticipated or understood. Oil starvation that killed expensive engines, strange drivability that disappointed street drivers, racing failures that made headlines for all the wrong reasons. But hidden beneath those early problems was something truly extraordinary. A small block engine with airflow technology that was literally decades ahead of its time. Fix the oiling, choose the right camshaft, tune it properly for its intended use. And the Cleveland becomes exactly what Ford engineers dreamed it would be back in October 1969. A monster, a high-revving American V8 that refused to follow conventional rules, an engine that breathed like something twice its size while weighing far less. And maybe that's why people still talk about it today, more than 50 years later, because sometimes the engines that almost failed end up becoming the greatest legends of all. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the 351 Cleveland's troubled history and ultimate redemption, let me know in the comments what engine story you want to explore next, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next piece of forgotten muscle car history.